Hello and welcome to the Love History podcast. Lovely to see you here. I'm Mock O'Keefe. I'm an LGBTQ plus historian. You can find me on the socials at Mock O'Keefe, 2 E's, 2 F's and 1 E. And I'm joined by a fabulous co-host, Louisa.
Hello, everybody. Hello. I'm Louisa, and I'm on Instagram and Facebook as Louisa Scott Sewing because I make historical clothes.
Super. Well, the Love History podcast is an opportunity for us two geeks who love history to talk to other people who either work in history or write about history. And we've got an amazing episode coming up for you today with an interview with Liz Fenwick, who is an author of romantic and historical fiction. And she talks about her process of writing a novel. She talks about her love and her representation of Cornwall. And she also talks about the responsibility that she feels when she writes about historical characters. But before we hear from Liz, Louisa, we have had an email to lovehistorypodcast@gmail.com. So that's lovehistorypodcast@gmail.com. If you have any questions for Louisa and I, please send us an email there. But Louisa, I am going to ask you what Laura has sent in her email. And her question is, if you could travel back in time to any historical period, when would it be and why?
Wow, that's such a big question. There are so many eras I would love to go to. But because I've been dressing up in 1890, 1900 quite a lot recently, I've been very lucky enough to use a lot of my great-grandmother's jewellery. And she died when I was 5, so I did know her and I vaguely remember her. But I would love to go back to around 1900, just before she got married, and just talk to her and all about the things that I've been making, and wonder whether we would actually look quite alike, maybe in some of my costumes, and just be like pals, both sort of age 30-ish, that kind of era. It would be fascinating to ask her all those questions. Yeah. But Mock, when would you go back in history?
So I think I would go back to visit Oscar Wilde. He knew he was about to get arrested, and he was hanging out at the Cadogan Hotel in Knightsbridge with his friend Robbie, and the police were on their way. And I don't think he had any forethought that he was going to have such an appalling time. He was sentenced to 2 years hard labor in Reading jail that then broke him. He destroyed his place in society. He, had to flee to France, a broken man, and died over there. I would literally buy him a drink at the bar and say, Oscar, you need to go now whilst you still have your faculty, agency, and a bit of money. Flee like many LGBTQ plus people did in those times. Go abroad and establish a life when you are fully in charge of your faculties and not a broken man. And I'd probably also tell him that one day you will be held up as an icon. You'll be known the world over for being a gay man, and everyone will love the fact that you were a gay man, and people will be able to get married, and they will have your poems and your writings read out at their weddings.
And I would love for him to know how much he's loved now, and the same goes for Alan Turing. I would love for him to know, because he had a very, very sad end, and to think that we're all using mobile phones and everything because of him.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. So how the world changes. And that, in a way, is why we're here talking about history. So let's hear from Liz and about her writing process about Cornwall. And then, as we usually do, come back quickly at the end and say, what have we learned from Liz? So let's hear from Liz Fenwick. Hello, Liz. Lovely to see the queen of contemporary Cornish fiction with us today. How are you?
I'm doing okay. A little bit of coughing and sneezing.
Well, a lot of it about at the moment, unfortunately. Well, thank you so much for sharing it, sharing your time with us today, but not sharing it, doing it by Zoom, so we're not in the same room. Very much appreciate that.
Much safer this way.
Now, we met a couple of years ago on social media, and you very kindly sent me some of your books. Some of which I have here, others of which I have purchased and seen in bookstores. Very excited whenever you see a friend's book in a store. And you are known as the queen of contemporary Cornish fiction, but also known for romantic and historical fiction. So that's what I want to chat to you a little bit around today, because at the Love History podcast, we love history. We love, Louise and I love romance. So you've got everything that we love together. And you know, I love Cornwall. So I'm going to jump straight in, if that's all right. Because one of the things I love about your novels is they have these dual timelines. You weave them together quite seamlessly, but it's a very particular kind of storytelling technique. Taking history, reflecting it in the present. What draws you to that, and what are the kind of the challenges around writing in that particular way?
What draws me to it is it's the stories that I love. I love solving a mystery. I also love a love story. So if I put the two together, and it's easier to have a mystery in the past, something that needs to be resolved for the people in the present time. So that's what's kind of drawn me to it. And it was a long time before I felt I had the confidence to write historical fiction. And now you can't get me out of it.
Well, I mean, a lot of your novels, I love it, you know, and are based significantly in the past. As an author, do you think there are particular challenges or responsibilities around factual accuracy or representing your protagonists in the context of their period, sometimes of which may have different values or attitudes to our own? What are some of the kind of challenges around and research you do when you're writing historical fiction?
Oh, that's a big question. There are many things. It's a fine balance between being true to history and respecting your current day readers and their sensibilities. So in order to find that happy balance, I just let myself write the first draft the way it comes out, using the language that I think is appropriate. And then in later drafts, I then go through and look at it and think, how would a modern day reader react to this terminology? And is there another way I can say it that will be less offensive, but still be true to the time? It's very tricky because, dare I say it, a lot of people called their black labs the N-word. And in fact, there was one that was very famous, and I can't remember who it was now, that's what their dog was called. And of course,
I think it was in the Dam Busters.
yes, that's it. And if you were being totally true to history, you would use that. But there's no way that would not pull a modern day reader straight out of the story. And then they're thinking about, oh my God, is it appropriate? Da, 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 da. And that loses the point. So the point is to keep your reader in the story, but still being true, potentially using different terminology. I particularly struggled on this one with my character of John Baker in The Secret Shore, who is a gay man. And there was terminology used at that time that is not really acceptable today. And I thought, okay, we have got to be true to him and true to what he was and true to what people around him would have said. But how can I do this without falling into a minefield of things that are going to pull the people out of the story?
How do you go about doing your research then? How do you go and research these time periods and these characters?
Well, I've learned by my mistakes. That's the key thing. When I wrote Cornish Stranger, which was my third book, I was certain that was going to tell the story of the SOE operating on the Helford River. And I spent a month deep diving into the SOE. Then I wrote the first draft, and it's not in there at all. So now I have learned to do only enough historical research in order to write the first draft, and I mark it up when I know I need to go deeper. I put X's in the script, and then I dive into those things because I love research, and I would spend my whole time researching. I mean, for The Secret Shore, I read 40 books and countless academic papers in order to do that. I overdo the research. For The River Between Us, I wrote, there are letters that come back in that from the front in France. There's no actual scenes in France in that sense in the war, but I read the complete annals of the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry from 1914 to 1918, just so I had a feel for what was going on. I read the industrial history of the Tamar, which doesn't impact the book at all, but it gave me the confidence to write the story I wanted to tell.
You sound like a method actor, because that's what they do. They research their character, even though it has nothing to do with the storyline. So you can get a feel for it.
Yes, definitely get a feel for it. And it does, in a way, color the story, because they're more confident in the character they're playing, and I'm more confident in the writer that I'm being and the story I'm portraying, because I know these things are going on around it, but it's not necessarily pertinent to the story itself.
I wanted to ask, you've set First World War, Second World War. Would you, so my question kind of has two parts to it. I was wondering initially whether you might have interviewed your grandparents, or there must be some reason why you chose that part of history. And the second part of my question is, would you choose anywhere further back in time?
Okay. My grandparents, I never met either grandmother. My paternal grandfather lived with us, but I was too young at the time to really ask the questions. I did interview my great uncle who lived across the street, and all my grandparents emigrated from Ireland. So I, as my senior thesis from Mount Holyoke, wrote 3/4 of a novel called The Irish Woman. And it was telling the typical story of a young woman leaving Ireland, coming to the States, ending up in domestic service, following what my grandmothers had done, my great aunts and so forth. So I did a lot of research into that area at the time, never finished that book, and then went off and lived life and gained world experience, and then started writing the books that I write now. I did speak to my mother-in-law. My 5th book, The Returning Tide, is based on one key experience of hers during the war. She was a telegraphist. She was doing Morse code, and she was working the night of the Slapton Sands disaster, Operation Tiger, or Exercise Tiger, when the Germans got among the practice landing. And so many Americans were killed that night. And of course, she heard them die. And she said this one night at the dinner table, and she said, I heard them die. And I said, what do you mean? She said, they stopped using code. They went to plain language. And that stayed with me. She's long since left us, unfortunately. And I built my novel around that experience. And I would love to go back and interview her more, because her whole world is really fascinating. In fact, that my husband's family is really interesting. Mine is deeply dull. But, his great grandmother had ended up coming back from India impoverished, because his great grandfather had been gambling, and they lost all their money. So the grandmother came back with 4 daughters, and she ended up being housekeeper for Conan Doyle and for Mosley.
Oh, really?
Yes, I'd love to tell that story. But again, there's so many lovely, juicy bits of history I'd like to tap into. But going back, so that was some of the World War II stuff is probably influenced from my in-laws. My parents were too young. And with regard to World War I was absolutely terrified, because I was reaching back into a bit of history that really felt far away to me. So again, I did a tremendous amount of research, but it opened my worldview up a lot, because by writing about Lady Alice, the daughter of the Duke, so the 4th, 5th, I forget what Duke he was at this point, it's been too long ago since I wrote it, what a privileged position she sat in, but how little control of her life she had. And I found that a really interesting difference. And, the research into what clothing she would have worn, how would she have carried herself? And of course, I was writing this during the pandemic, and I spent hours on YouTube watching how a woman of that time got dressed. And thinking, can you actually row a boat if you are dressed as such? And, all those things that come into it. But it is a really interesting thing about how clothing changes you and changes how you feel. Going back to the returning tide, one of my characters, when she became a wren and she gets her uniform for the first time and people look at her differently and she carries herself differently. And I hadn't realized how much that plays into it until I was at the Romantic Novelist Conference that year as I was writing the book. Fortunately came in and they were giving a talk on clothing and they asked for a volunteer and I was put in this beautiful Japanese kimono. And I immediately held myself differently. I moved differently. And I think it's a really important thing, specifically if you're working his historical stuff, is how did the clothing that they wore affect them?
I was going to say, going back to the method actor style, if you were to dress in something of the era and then you would get a feel of how would I sit, how would I speak, how would I, yes, everything that goes with wearing something historical.
Even how would I breathe? You know, all those things are so incredibly different. Of course, during the pandemic, there was no option of trying anything on or doing anything. The only thing I've done close to that, again, it was through the Romantic Novelists, and they did this historical day, and we had the opportunity to dress in Regency clothes, and that was fascinating.
I'm looking at Mock here. He's very excited because we're both going to a Regency party together.
Oh, are you going to the ball?
Yes.
Oh,
We are. And Louisa and I this week have been planning what I'm going to wear. But people will have all heard about that in the introduction to today's episode, so you won't go too much into that. Louisa, I know we're talking about clothes, and I know that you are, very interested in historical fashion. Anything else you want to ask Liz around clothing or historical fashion?
Well, the second part of my question was, would you set a book any further back in history? Because I'm thinking Cornwall, Poldark, everybody loves all of that kind of windswept, or perhaps a sort of Jane Eyre, not a Jane Eyre, yes, a Jane Eyre style, I don't know, something in a completely different century.
I have dealt in this a little bit. I was lucky enough to be asked to write a ghost story. It's out now, 13 Cornish ghost stories. And for that, I went back to the 1800s. And I had initially envisioned this scene walking along the cliffs near where I live, because two boats went down on the Manacles in the same night, a troop ship going out to the Peninsular War and a troop ship coming in. And the one going out, there was only one survivor, the drummer boy. And I thought, this is a cracking opening to a historical novel. And I wrote the opening and my editor said no. So that's been sitting there. But in preparation for this, I thought, if you're a woman of that time and you're walking the cliffs at night, how do you stay warm? Is a woolen shawl and your undergarments and stuff. So I did a little bit of practicing to see. I mean, I looked like a complete loon, but I wanted to know if, enough woolen layers would keep you warm. But no, the ghost story is fascinating because I don't think most people realize that until I think 6 years before this the story is set, if you had a shipwreck in Cornwall, you were pretty much buried where you landed. So you're buried on the cliffs with no markings or anything else. It was after a big disaster in the Helston area at Lobar that they changed the law. So you have to be buried in a graveyard. And so I had this imagery of this woman walking the cliffs at night and the dead talking and walking with her.
That would be great. You must write that book.
Well, the short story's there anyway. Maybe I'll continue it. But there are challenges going back that far. Somebody said it's very difficult to write a story when there's no electric light, and it takes getting yourself into the mindset of what is available at the time, and it's very easy to slip.
We'll wait and see. You talked there about walking on the cliffs, and I follow you on Instagram, and we'll make sure that in the show notes we link to your social medias. You talk about and you take your viewers on social media on plot walks. Do you want to tell us a little bit about plot walks? I've only ever heard them from you. They're absolutely fascinating. What are they and how do they help you?
They are a vital part of my writing process, and they're also a vital part of my living process. They counteract writer's bottom because you spend most of your time sitting at the computer, so they're for that as well. But there is something about repetitive motion and allowing your brain to make connections. Um, Long distance driving can do the same thing. But walking and going out with no set idea in my mind, with the big sky above me and nature, it allows connections to happen that don't happen sitting at my desk. And that's why it's so vital, because it's that stepping away from the actual act of creation and letting the subconscious, the mind, do what it needs to do. And walking allows it, it gives it permission really to do that, because I'm just looking at the blue sky or the gray sky or what's blooming in the hedges at the time. And of course, that's all research because I'm writing about where I am, and that obviously layers into my fiction. But it is a key thing for creativity. And if I'm stuck, going out even for a 5-minute walk can make all the difference in the world.
And you talk about writing where you live. You live in Cornwall. You clearly love Cornwall, but you're not Cornish. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about the route that took you to Cornwall? And also, when we first met, you talked about your husband doing the Cornish test. You must share that story too.
Well, he's the whole reason Cornwall. Okay. Try and do this concisely, but give you the funny bits. I made the decision to come to the UK because I was bored with American men at the time. I was meeting lots of people with MBAs, out in the various bars and everything else, and they could talk to me about business or sport. Now, don't get me wrong. I love the Red Sox, the Celtics, the Patriots, and the Bruins, but there's more to life than sports and business. But that was the only conversation. And I came over on holiday, having met friends, acquaintances of my father's who were closer to my age than my dad's. And I had the time of my life. I went to the opera, I was at theatre, I was at museums, and all these guys I was meeting were able to talk to me about all these things. I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And one rather intoxicated evening, they said, do you realize you're eligible for Irish citizenship? And I said, well, yes, I've known that for years. And so the next morning, with a hangover, I picked up the paperwork, and 6 months later, I left Boston on the 19th of April. And if you know your US history, that's the day that Paul Revere wrote, the British are coming, the British are coming. And my mother said to me as I left, she said, you realize we won the war. 2 weeks later, there's more to this story. I mean, if I ever put it in a book, nobody would believe it. But 2 weeks later, I met the man who's now my husband. The person that I was flat share with was due to go on a blind date, and she decided she couldn't do this sober. So we were to meet a couple of her friends at the Pheasantry on King's Road, which is now a Pizza Express, much to my children's amusement. We had a very boozy lunch. And then we went and we sat at another table while she had tea with this farmer who had come up to meet her at the Basil Street Hotel. He was a pig farmer and he was a lovely man, but Anna was an advertising person, and it was just hysterical. And we sat a few tables away and watched. Well, Anna and the pig farmer didn't work, but Chris asked me on a date that night, and my first date was actually to go to Sunday lunch at his sister's the next day in Clifton. 2 weeks or 3 weeks after that, he took me to Cornwall for the first time, and I thought it was to meet his parents. But no, it was the Cornwall test. And if I hadn't fallen in love with Cornwall, then we wouldn't be 33 years married at this juncture. So Cornwall, I didn't realize was going to become my muse, but it did very much so.
Yeah, I love that story.
People often say, why do I write about Cornwall? And I remember the first time I went to Ireland when I was 13, and it was very immediate that my roots went into the ground. And everybody said to me, oh, you have the map of Ireland written across your face. And I felt very much at home, and the land spoke to me. And I went to Cornwall, and the land speaks to me, but my roots don't go into the ground. And the only way I can make it mine is to write stories about it.
Oh, I love that, because you do clearly absolutely love the landscape and the people of Cornwall. I mean, when I meet you in Cornwall, you're so proud of where you live. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. But talking of love, one of the things that interests me as an LGBTQ plus historian and person is you have a number of what I would call queer people in your novels. And I'm not sure they always pop up in romantic or historical novels. Why do you write about queer people? And again, are there any challenges as a straight woman, do you think, in doing that and representing them appropriately?
I was scared to initially, to be fair, because it's not my lived experience. And I think anytime, but then it's not my lived experience to be a Duke's daughter either. And I dove into that. So I think it was me becoming more confident as a writer and wanting to more people to find a home in my stories. There's a lovely man who buys my books every year down in St. Ives, and he wouldn't be what I would consider my traditional reader, but he adores them. And one time he said to me, "When am I going to see myself in your stories?" And I was so pleased at that point because I had finished The Secret Shore and I said, "I think you'll find this one a little bit different." And he was very pleased to see Lady Constance in The River Between Us. And I suppose the book that comes out next summer is a bolder step forward because the historical story is a love story between two women.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did. I mean, historical fiction, romantic fiction, we've talked a little bit about sometimes it's a bit poo-pooed out there in the wider literary world, isn't it? If you had to argue your case for romantic and historical fiction, what would you say? What would you shout back at the critics?
One, it's entertainment, and we all need to escape from the lives that we're living and what we're seeing in the world. And I think what historical fiction and romantic fiction do is they show possibilities of how people have made it through. You know, in the past, things weren't always good. And how did they get beyond their grief, beyond the things that were put against them? And in love stories, it's a case of if that person was able to find love with what they had going against them, then maybe I could too. Or maybe it's a case of reliving that joy. Because if you've been in a relationship for a long time, you have to stop and pause and remember what those initial sparks felt like. So it is a gift to the from the writer to the reader that they're going to be transported somewhere else.
I love that, and particularly at the moment when the world at times can feel quite difficult. I know I've started turning off the news. You've just been out in the States during the election, so I think having somewhere to escape to is a wonderful thing. Now, before we wrap up, I've got a bit of a rapid fire questions for you. I know when I sent you our notes in advance, I said there'd be something around kind of just a quick fire question. So I've got them here. I want you to give your first response, if I may. So, UK or USA?
UK.
Okay. The past or the present?
The present.
Ooh, okay. Cream first or jam first?
Jam first.
Ooh. Scone or scone?
Scone.
Scone. Well done. Well done. Romance or history?
Oh, history.
Okay. And finally, digital books like a Kindle or a physical book in your hand?
Physical book every time,
Oh,
unless I'm on holiday.
super. Well, listen, if anyone wants to find your books, we'll put links in the show notes. We'll make sure that your latest book as well, The Ghost Story, is up there, and a link to your website. We'll put a link to your socials as well. But just in case anyone doesn't find the show notes, if they want to find you on socials, how can they find you, Liz?
I am mostly on Insta these days, but I'm also on Facebook, occasionally on TikTok. I'm venturing into threads. I'm kind of abandoning what I used to love, which was known as Twitter. I'm still there. I pop in, but it's a little too toxic these days.
So lurking away. Well, we'll make sure that all of your links are there. And just from Louisa and I, it's been absolutely lovely to see you again, Louisa. I'm sure you enjoyed hearing and listening to Liz today. And thank you so much for your time, Liz. I hope you get over your cold.
Liz.
And wishing you, I know you've got Delivering Christmas. Everyone's feeling Christmassy. They can go out and buy that novel. Wishing you a very happy Christmas when it comes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you.
Well, that was very interesting, wasn't it? Isn't she lovely?
I loved talking to her. She was brilliant. I could speak to her for another half an hour.
Yeah. I mean, it was great. When I met her in Cornwall a couple of years ago, we were down staying at St. Ives, and she messaged me, and the only day I could do it was my birthday. And I was thinking, who is this person? I'm going to have a cup of coffee with my birthday. And I literally felt like she was my birthday present. It was just so lovely meeting her.
That's so lovely.
First time you've met her, though, obviously you've checked her out on Instagram, and you had a look at some of her books. I know you're going to read all of them now, but what did you learn from spending that time with Liz?
Oh, from that very, very short time with her, of course, I've got so many more questions, but the one thing I love the most, being a historical costumier, is the fact that she, when thinking about what her characters are wearing when she's setting a bit of the book in the past, she explained that she went to a romantic fiction conference and she volunteered to try something on, and then feeling, gosh, I feel different. How do I hold myself now? And I guess it's the feel of the fabrics, and get a real proper insight to how that character feels when they're wearing historical clothes. How about you, Mock? What was the biggest thing you got from it?
So it wasn't about the clothing, although I thought that was something that would definitely appeal to you. I was interested in the amount of research that she does, the fact that so much of her research and context is done, but so little appears in her writing, and sometimes none of it does. And it's just about really immersing herself in the time period. And me, as an LGBTQ plus historian, I do a lot of research, and sometimes none of it ends up in my Instagram reels or my YouTube videos, and I feel slightly frustrated that I wasted that time. But Liz gives me encouragement that I didn't.
But it's not, because it's all in there. It's all in you, and you're then able to explain what you want to explain.
Yeah, she talked about having the confidence, which I really loved. So our time together is at an end, but if anyone wants to get in contact with us, they can contact us on lovehistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can find Louisa at Louisa Scott Sewing on Facebook and on Instagram and YouTube. You can find me on @Mock O'Keefe, 2 E's, 2 F's and 1 E. Louisa, we will meet again next Thursday. We've got an exciting episode, which is on historical fashion. We won't say any more. And if you are enjoying this podcast, dear listener, we would ask you to give us a subscription, give us a follow on our socials, and maybe tell at least one other person about the podcast and write a little review. It really helps, because we do this because we love it, and we'd love to hear from you either on Gmail, in a review, or by sharing it with a friend. But for now, wherever you are and whoever you love, from Louisa and I, have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye, everybody.